What was I saying initially? Hang on, I'm not very with it today. I'm trying to give you like a 3D eco poetry kind of portrait.
Hi everyone, welcome to Poetology. I'm Dan, and today I'm going to interview Caleb Parkin, and we will discuss his collection This Fruiting Body, as well as his more recent pamphlet, The Coin, which is about to be published at the end of the month. We talk about queerness and ecopoetics, as well as writing for therapeutic purposes and healing. I hope you enjoy the interview, and I'll see you at the end. Hi, Caleb.
Morning, how you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. It's so nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And today we're going to talk about your poetry and queer eco-poetry, and especially your collection, This Fruiting Body, but also work that you've been doing more recently. So my first question to you is, how did this collection, This Fruiting Body, come about, and how did it develop over time?
Yeah, I guess so. I was really happy to publish a collection with Nine Arches, and I suppose the book came about. Jane Comain at Nine Arches had seen some of the work being performed at some festivals and things as I was starting to develop it, and I had really enjoyed it. So, which was really great, because then it's meant that when I started to send kind of manuscript, so I sent a kind of manuscript, she had some sense of the work. But the big thing, I guess, was that I got Arts Council Developing Your Creative Practice funding to work on it, and that really was such a, the whole thing with that is it's meant to be a kind of step change in your practice. And so I applied twice, and then the second time when I applied, got the funding. So that was about £10,000 to both, which included having some mentoring with Carrie Etta, who I'd worked with on the pamphlet Wasted Rainbow as well. So she mentored me on the collection work, and started bringing that all together. And then I guess I sent it to Jane in one form that I thought kind of worked, and I'd done all this work on kind of ordering it. And there was this kind of series of poems as kind of section headers, and it had one title. And then she was like, no, don't do that, and suggested something completely different. And actually then we started to kind of piece it together in a way that was where the kind of poems ran in kind of eddies of theme and subject, and so flowed together without the kind of section headers, and it worked much better. So it's really, I felt like I had lots of good editorial input over the time of its development.
And do you find that your relationship to earlier poems changes as you write new ones? How do they end up fitting together?
Yeah, they definitely do. So there's poems in there which were written some years ago, and then really much more recent ones that were written during the DYCP time. Or I guess like I sort of realised I was writing queer eco poetry when I realised that was a thing, because I didn't always know it was a thing. And I was like, oh, okay. So actually then some of the kind of overtly queer poems with subjects that are quite clearly queer, then fitted together with all the kind of more than human and ecological poems that have a queer element to them, and then figuring out how they all spoke to each other in the collection was really fun. But yeah, some of them are quite old poems, but actually it's quite nice. Like, I think when you recontextualize a poem, then it completely changes. And I felt like that happened quite a few times with pieces in the collection. There's a new habitat for the poems, I guess, and then you sort of introduce it to the new habitat, and it's like, oh, okay, it does something different here.
So you mentioned eco-poetry and queer eco-poetry. So what is eco-poetry in general, and what does it mean to queer it?
Yeah, I found I found a really good definition that I like to use, actually, that I might read you, because I think it's really helpful, because otherwise I'll kind of fudge it, as you always do with these things. For me, I think it's so much about connection, both between all life on Earth and the planet itself, and matter and material. So this whole kind of biosphere in which we exist. And I think eco-poetry, much more than what we might call nature poetry, really explores all of those connections, and their possibilities and their pitfalls and the fraughtness of all of those connections. But I suppose like eco-poetry, so this was a definition I really liked. It's from Kind and Kind in a book called Wild Correspondings. So they said, there are many definitions of eco-poetry, but we think of it as poetry that aspires to be conscious of what we are doing when we describe, record, interact with, or take from what we call nature. It's a poetry that recognises the natural world as source, not resource, and to that end experiments with language itself and the act of writing in ways that might help us to reimagine our relationship with the non-human. And the last bit, which I think is really important, we trust it is also grounded in the respectful connections between people and peoples, aware of the extractivist roots of climate change, environmental degradation, and species extinction. So there's loads in there, and I just felt like that was a really good definition to me of where we are now, 21, 22 with eco-poetry, and really considering that wider context, as they say, of the extractivist roots of climate change, its connections to colonialism, and how we start to try and kind of get to grips with that in the kind of muddle we're in right now globally.
And so where does the queer aspect come in? Yeah,
this is so interesting. I've just been having an exchange with a tutor I'm going to be working with next year about this, of what that means. And there's that kind of Munoz, isn't it, that idea of queer horizons, sort of never reaching. And I wonder if like queer eco-poetry is something similar. For me, there's some aspect, I think a lot of eco-poetry gets a bit stuck in certain affect, like emotional affect. And I think like grief and loss and anger are entirely valid and can be really important and motivating. But I also feel like that's often just where like eco-poetry can get a bit stuck on those. So there's a writer called Nicole Seymour who I epigraph at the beginning of the book, and who wrote a book, I've got it up here, Bad Environmentalism, Irony and Irreverence in the Ecological Age. And that was really, when I read that it was towards the end of writing actually, but I was really like, oh, okay, that's part of what I'm up to here. And she talks about queer environmental affect. So that in queer culture, there's often, well, the way she talks about it is there are kind of environmental affects that she's sort of schematized that often go on. So things like restraint, austerity, giving things up, responsibility, asceticism, self-denial, guilt, all of these ones, which we often associate with like environmental movements or, with eco themes. And then she's trying to track them against kind of queer culture, where there's often a kind of counterbalancing affect. So I've got it on my other screen. It's like restraint versus indulgence, austerity versus excess, of course, like guilt versus pride. And she's like, okay, so there's, what if we kind of play with this kind of these queer environmental effects, or cultural effects, as she puts it. So I guess I found that really exciting, actually. Like, what can we do with some of those, as well as there is rage, there is grief in the book as well, and they're welcome. But I feel like they're part of the spectrum of our affect when we think about environment and eco writing. So that's part of it. And also, I suppose, a lot of the ways that nature and environmental writing is coded is in a very heteronormative, future-oriented way about saving the world for my brackets, white Western children. And also that the way that nature is constructed within culture is incredibly heteronormative too. So I read some really various interesting things within queer ecologies. So that's the other, I'm doing this in a very roundabout way. Queer ecologies is this big kind of school of interdisciplinary thought that's kind of emerging ever more, which is between like literature, cultural theory, geography, various other disciplines. There's a great article which focuses on geese, actually, as an example, and humans are often like, or culture constructs geese as these like monogamous, heterosexual, nuclear family units. When you actually look at the behavior of geese, there's all sorts going on. There's same-sex partnerships, there's some really, as with lots of non-human animals, there's all sorts going on that when you frame it in human heteronormative conservative terms, it's just, people don't want to look at that stuff, so they don't. So actually, we can look at the more than human world and find examples for anything we want, in fact, within human behavior. anything at all. But actually it's just this, well, this writer Alex Johnson says, this kind of humbling indication of the variety of life on Earth, and to decenter ourselves. I think that's part of what the kind of the whole kind of queer eco-poetry thing is, to try and like decenter ourselves a little, or at least represent some different possibilities within the more than human world, or non-human world, because it's not just doing one convenient thing. You know, there's orgies, there's definitely like sex changes, there's polyamory, there's like it's all happening. But there's also really grim stuff. There's infanticide and there's cannibalism, and it's, you know, and it's actually nothing. There's a kind of double thing here, I suppose. It's kind of nothing to do with us in a way. Like those beings are all existing on their own terms. But at the same time, we're deeply connected to all of that life on Earth. So we need to kind of decenter ourselves to have an authentic connection, I think, to all that life, which is not about us. It's about all of us on our own terms. So I suppose that's kind of where I approach it from.
Yeah. And in your own collection, there's also that sort of materialism with a lot of lush imagery. And that imagery is taken both from what we conceive of as the natural, like, I don't know, the seaside or something, or, you know, some animals, but also, you know, chip shops and material culture that is made by human, and it all plays up together in really interesting ways.
Yeah, I think that's also something I get a bit frustrated about, is this kind of refusal to think about technology, because it's too late. Like we've it's, you know, cat's out the bag in terms of we've got technology. We need to really try and think about it cleverly and in a nuanced way, and that includes, you know, our material culture of all of this stuff that we make. That also kind of, for me, I suppose, stemmed from an interest in museums and museum writing. And there are some museum, you know, it starts and closes with museum poems, which is a slightly different thing. They're kind of reflecting on that problematic history of museums and our relationship to the exhibits, as in the non-human life within them. But museums in themselves are such an interesting space for thinking about material culture, and that is something I did want to bring in, and has quite a strong thread through the book as well. I think we just kind of try and ignore it, but actually this stuff that we have around us all came from somewhere, you know, and it has to go somewhere. And so as we keep thinking about it all as separate from the biosphere, then I think that's a huge problem. So I kind of want to draw attention to stuff.
I think I'll go to now a completely different subject, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
and ask you about the work you're doing in creative writing for therapeutic purposes and how poetry contributes to healing.
Yeah, I do think there's a crossover as well, because so many people are experiencing this kind of existential eco anxiety and, you know, it's kind of climate change dread, and it can feel very overwhelming and disempowering. And I guess on a personal level, I've always found that poetry is a way of containing some of that difficulty. It's like managing to kind of contain it somehow and give it shape and give it articulation, rather than it being nebulous and vague and frightening, which I think a lot of these big ideas, these big abstractions, really can feel that way. So I studied an MSc Creative Writing for Therapeutic Purposes. So that's CWTP for short. But the more I think about it, the more I think CW, Creative Writing, or just poetry writing, or when workshops or writing for craft. And then there's kind of CWTP, which is more ostensibly about process and about a group process sometimes, or individual, or working with one practitioner. But I think all writing is on a continuum, really. You know, sometimes it's entirely about writing for the process. But I mean, why would anyone write if it's not partly about the process and about? So I don't see them as completely distinct. And so it's that point about healing. I certainly think that can be the case. Not always, actually. So, or, you know, it might just be a way of coming to terms with something that's not resolved, but it you know, being on the page or having been processed through the writing to just feel unresolved. And that's, I think, a lot of poetry is doing that, you know, the strong articulation of mixed feelings. So yeah, it's something that's always around for me. And sometimes I just need to get back to the process of writing for its own sake, and some of that might become, I certainly think, like in the collection and in the pamphlet, some of that started off as writing for its own sake and then became writing that I wanted to edit and bring to fruition. So yeah, I see it all in a continuum, really. But I'm really glad I have that practice, because when I'm feeling a bit disillusioned about writing as a kind of, well, I guess as an art form or something to kind of publish, which I think lately I've slightly gotten out of the habit of writing poems, but then I just have to remember to get back into the process, and then it's not scary anymore. And for me, that's what that practice has given. Yeah. There's also, so something I've just been working on with Cheltenham Festivals is a publication called The Scribbled Self, and that's a young people's writing for wellbeing resource, which we've co-produced. I don't have it yet because we're launching it on Sunday, and that's the kind of the legacy project of a project called Beyond Words, which is a writing for wellbeing project with young people, often working in museums actually. So there's that connection between material culture and writing for wellbeing, which I think is I find really interesting. I love using stuff. So that publication that they've co-produced and that I've edited, it is going to be out Sunday, and then there'll be copies distributed to schools. And so I hope that's going to perhaps start a writing practice for lots of young people, which would be great, because that's when I started writing. I don't know about you, but it was it's my teens and I started then, so it's nice to be able to hand that on, I think.
Yeah, it's lovely working with younger people.
Yeah, healing is interesting, isn't it? I suppose it might suggest a sort of end point, but I think we're probably always healing in some respect, or I sort of see it as gardening. We're always kind of tending, and I certainly feel like I need to keep up that process of tending.
Tell us about the coin and your latest projects.
This month I've got a sort of hat trick of publications, which is really exciting. And it's a year since the collection, and I've had some other things in the pipeline. So things I've got coming up. So last week we launched this, which actually I'm hoping you can see is also the hoodie I'm wearing, which is the cover artwork.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Which is a sort of sad chihuahua in leather gear. So this is my collected Bristol City Poet commissions. It's called All the Cancelled Parties. And I've just finished my time as City Poet, handed over to Cat Lyons, who's taken that on. And so this will be available as a PDF on the Bristol Ideas website, so you can download it for free. And we've also got some of these events I'll be giving some of these out as well. So I was thinking I was going to read a poem that moved from a City Poet commission into the collection, which that's quite pleasing that it's in both. So that's one thing. Really nice to see all of the commissions in print, because they're really varied and different, particular body of work that are poems written for the city. And so I say only one of those has migrated over. I wonder if the poem rather featuring the sad leather chihuahua might make it into the next collection, because I really like it, but it'll need some editing first. So that's that's one of them. And then the Scribbled Self is out on Sunday, and then will be distributed and everything. And then the coin is the pamphlet with Broken Sleep, which is out on the 30th officially, and I'm launching a Satellite of Love in Bristol on the 26th. And that's quite different again. I think I quite like keeping readers guessing a bit. It's a pamphlet, and it's quite a lot of poems that relate to matriarchs in my family, and cancer and class and place. And some of those talking about the writing for wellbeing side of things as well. Some of those I felt like at the time were definitely about me processing, working through, but they then go through a process. I think editing is part of that, where it adds to that containment. So it's kind of quite vulnerable work, a lot of the coin, but I'm quite excited about that, and a bit scared, because it's different to a lot of the work in the collection, certainly, but I think having those different strands to your writing is kind of cool and exciting. And
what drew you back to the pamphlet form for the coin?
I think pamphlets are amazing. I really love them. I'm always, when you can sort of sit down and read pretty much all of a pamphlet in one sitting sometimes, which I don't think I can with a collection, maybe some collections. I suppose with this one, it was that I had a sort of these offshoots, these poems that were kind of emerging about matriarch figures in my family, about my mum's had a couple of bouts of treatment for cancer, and I was writing about some of that and about where I'm from over in the Essex-Suffolk border and class, and it's a bit of autoethnography, I guess, there about my family and some of the ways that our identities manifest, I guess. So that's all in there. But I sort of noticed it was a sort of strand that was appearing, but I felt like it was probably a pamphlet's worth, and so I was kind of putting them aside and thinking, okay, maybe that'll go there. But then actually sometimes a poem would emerge that I'd be like, oh, okay, it's that again, and I'd sort of pop it with those. So it just felt like that was the right length and the right form for it was a pamphlet. So I hope people enjoy it and it starts some interesting conversations. I was thinking as well about queer poetics. It's not overtly queer in a way, but what I'm kind of exploring as well in it is what it might mean to be a man in a female lineage in a way, or a kind of man who I suppose I sort of often relate more to the women in my family than I do to the men, but so there's a kind of queering of gender in it, and then I'm a bit like, I don't really know what that means, if it means anything, but I don't really. Yeah, so it's a sort of curiously queer pamphlet in that regard, and I'd like some conversations to start about some of those subjects.
It sounds fantastic. When is it coming out?
Yeah, so 30th online. Broken Sleep are doing an online launch for a few publications.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
I can't show you that. I think it exists, but I haven't got it. But
Really?
it's a really gorgeous cover as well.
I'm sure. And you're gonna get another shirt or hoodie.
Well, so what I'm going to do, right, it's in my mission to be able to wear all of my book covers. I'm going to get a t-shirt. I'm going to get a t-shirt of the coin cover, and then I've got the hoodie of all the cancelled parties, and then I've got a bomber jacket which is of this fruiting body, and then I can layer in the books.
Oh my god, it's the best idea.
Okay, you know what I'm saying about like queer environmental affect and like, you know, excess? I feel like sometimes yeah, I enjoy that.
That's so great. So can you read us the poem you were talking about?
Oh yeah, sure. So
Thank you.
so started as a City Poet Commission, and it was for the launch of a book called The Good Ancestor by Roman Krajnik. I hope I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, so I'm really sorry, Roman, if I've got it wrong. So there's the book The Good Ancestor is about thinking as a good ancestor, so leaving a habitable planet for future generations. And there was a kind of epigraph in it, and a lot of it's great, kind of cathedral thinking of like longer term and like, you know, beyond oneself and decentering the human, all of these kinds of things. And the epigraph was something about waking up and feeling worried about the future you're leaving for your grandchildren. And it sort of assumed that everyone reading it was going to reproduce, I think. And I was like, interesting. And again, this is one of the ways that I think environmentalism is coded in certain terms, quite unthinkingly. And as a perhaps like queer minority in all of this, I was just a bit like, well, I still think it's worth saving, but I don't think it's worth saving just for my children or my grandchildren. I think it's worth saving on its own terms. So I kind of wanted to respond. And so I've researched some animals that might not be hugely loved. And not many people like spiders. I think spiders are amazing. So I researched spiders and found some endangered spiders, and discovered the spruce fir moss spider, which is the tiniest tarantula in the world. It's of the tarantula family, but it's tiny, and it lives in the Appalachian Mountains. And I adopted it as my great-great-grand spider for the poem. Yeah, so it's called Great-Great-Grand Spider 2120. And the epigraph is Rebecca Tomas from Stranger Essays on the Human and Non-Human. And it's love for things that are nothing like us and which may not love us back. Great-Great-Grand Spider 2120. Microhexura motivaga is my adoptive great spruce fir moss grand spider, world's smallest tarantula, thriving still on rocky outcrops in South Appalachia, where she remains too busy for me or humanity. She'll never visit 22nd century compostable cities, messy green conglomerations of enmeshed species. Her territory is 3 meters squared, and she does not care about any sustainably developed policy. Right now, she's gracefully enveloping a springtail half her own mass. She doesn't realise we inhaled our bloated CO2, learned to view mountains as our teachers. She doesn't give 2 shakes of her thorax that once you sent a passionate email to your MP, RE that ancient tree, or buried seeds for future non-humanity. She is sole treasurer of her nation of moss, constructing a funnel 8 millimeters wide to shelter from the now customary blizzards and rains. She jostles her spinnerets, tethers high tensile time from her abdomen to the undiscovered planet of her boulder. She is now. Loamy water tasted in mouth parts, the brisk prickle of snowmelt soaked through this understory, the scattering of prey away from her clustered eyes. She couldn't care less that every single vote was counted, mattered, because look, here come those great-great-great-grand spiders, those great-great-great-great, add as many greats as you like, grand spiders, who'll thrive too, not caring if we were part of the reason she's here. Balanced like, but nothing like, a world-renowned acrobat on the glittering white promise of her egg sac.
Fantastic, thank you. Have you read, is it The Child to Come? It's by Rebecca Sheldon, The Child to Come, Life After the Human Catastrophe. And it's about sci-fi movies and how they often focus on that idea of the child, you know, the future child, the only child that survives and gives birth to, you know, a new humanity, and all hope is focused on that one child.
And there's like a lot of pressure, isn't there, on like young people as well in this way that I'm a bit like, you know, and sometimes that there's what's the kind of anti-futurity as well within certain theory of like that whole thing of always thinking about the future in that way, in a very normative, heteronormative way, which isn't always very helpful. And so one of the ideas Nicole Seymour talks about is existing nonetheless, which lots of LGBT plus people, that's the case. Like we kind of exist nonetheless without some of those same ideas of futurity. So I guess, you know, that's in that poem, as well as really trying to celebrate the spider as much as I can on its own terms.
Yes.
Through like really, really close observation, and I researched it really thoroughly. And so I hope it sort of makes people fall in love with the spider a bit. That was part of the idea.
Yeah, I like spiders. I think I'm up for it. I like this idea that it's a spider you have never and will never encounter, this idea of that creature that will not really care for you, but you can find some sort of kinship with.
Yeah, because, you know, again, it's kind of exploding that idea of what kinship might mean. It might not mean that I have this direct genetic connection, or like where, you know, it's like actually it could just mean a kinship to all of life. And that's quite, you know, I don't know, for lots of people that seems entirely reasonable to me.
Well, thank you so much for this interview, Caleb. We'll put all your details under the video so people can connect with you. And I hope I'll have you again for one of your future, maybe the pamphlet that's coming out, or one of your future collections.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caleb.
Thanks, Dan. Cheers.
Thank you again, Caleb, for a wonderful and inspiring interview. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. All the details are beneath the video in the description, and I hope to see you all again very soon. Bye!